still do stuff for SAIS. Like I just spoke with one of their classes, and I'm still a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. So it's nice to stay connected. Yeah. Yeah.
That's excellent.
We are live.
Great.
Meeting is now streaming live on Facebook. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're listening, this is the PUAN session on Black Lives Matter. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for the panelists for being a part of this. Let me just officially introduce them all to you. Shamila Chaudhary was appointed the president of the American Pakistan Foundation. She worked at the Political Risk from Eurasia Group and has 12 years of experience working in the US government, including at the White House as the director for Pakistan and Afghanistan on the National Security Council. We also have Keome Rowe, who is a public diplomacy officer. Keome is currently a press officer in the public affairs section at US Embassy Islamabad. He's a Texas native, as is Cameron. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Keome served as the assistant to the mayor of Fort Worth. We also have Cameron Thomas Shah, who's the Cultural Affairs and Human Rights Officer in Karachi. He's been in Foreign Service for 7 years, and prior to Pakistan, served in Honduras and Vietnam. He's originally from Detroit, Michigan. So I got it wrong that he's from Texas. I have no idea why I had that notion in my mind. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening. The topic that we're going to discuss today is Black Lives Matter, which originated in the US, but has somehow become a global movement, which tends to happen with a lot of United States movements that they inspire movements around the world. So rather than me just asking you what the movement is, I'd like each and every one of you to answer, what is Black Lives Matter to you? Let's go in the reverse order that I introduced you. Cameron, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
Well, thank you, Shahzad. As you rightly point out, movements in the United States, they have a long and vibrant history. You can look back at the abolitionist movement in the 1800s to end slavery, to the suffragette movement in the early 1900s that we just celebrated 100 years for women to have the right to vote, and even the civil rights movement in the 1950s, which resulted in voting rights and civil rights for African Americans. So, to me, right now, we're in another moment in our country's history where people are, they have very valid complaints stemming from persistent instances of police brutality and structural racism that exist, not only in the United States, but all over the world. But what I know is that our country is much stronger than these injustices, and no matter what, we'll always fight for American values, liberty, justice, and freedom. In effect, I mean, this is the civil rights movement. This is it again, and we can all imagine ourselves. There's a meme out there, and it says, if you wonder what civil rights moment is going on right now, and so that's what I know what Black Lives Matter is. This is a movement for civil rights. It's a movement for equality, and it's a movement to end police brutality against Black people.
Keome?
Thank you. First, I want to thank our host, Shahzad, and my other co-panelists, Shamila and Cameron, as well as all of our viewers. Thank you for tuning in for this important topic. I somewhat agree with Cameron. I'd like to also add that I think Black Lives Matters is a movement to shed light on an issue in the United States, but it's also part of a movement that's part of the DNA of the United States and the American people. Because for hundreds of years, Americans have taken to the streets to basically say, this is what we believe, and we want to be heard. We will be heard. And so you're seeing different people come together from all different backgrounds in the United States to shed light on this. And I think more broadly speaking, taking to the streets is a place for collective voices outside of our three branches of government to have an integral aspect of our what it means to exercise our freedom. And it's also an opportunity for all of us to come together to in unity to shed light on something. And I think more broadly speaking, you don't necessarily have to agree with everything and be happy with your government all the time, but it is an opportunity to say, we're not happy with this issue and we disagree. We're still Americans. We still and it's part of our right as Americans to voice our opinion. And for Black Lives Matter, you're seeing different people come together to say, we're not happy with police, the way this structural racism or social inequality, and we want it to change. We've had enough. Thank you.
Shamila?
So well, first, thanks for having me. And it's great to be with folks who, Keome and Cameron from the State Department. I'm a graduate of the State Department myself, and I appreciate all that you're doing for us overseas. And so thank you so much for having this topic, first of all, because I think that, from my vantage point, like being part of a South Asian American community where there's a lot of hidden, like not hidden, but just like it's unspoken kind of racism. We've been trying very hard to shed light on systemic racism in the United States. And it's really nice and makes me feel optimistic that it's also coming from Pakistan, because our two communities kind of interact with each other a lot. So I appreciate that. And it got my attention that on the Twitterverse, for example, and a lot of people who are based in Pakistan now use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and that piqued my interest. And I think that what the notion of Black Lives Matter, this theme, has done is it's humanized the experience of the Black community in the United States, but it's also connected it to other, systematic inequality in other countries. So it's not just unique to the United States. There's lots of inequality, and I think people are connecting to that. And so it's an effort to humanize globally, but then also within the United States, it's an effort to humanize because these issues are not new. Like if you're an ally of the Black community, or you've been fighting for racial justice, if you are Black, none of this is new. And it's like, how did it take this long for people to take to the streets? And it's like, finally people are doing this. And I think it also shows that there's a generational gap in the United States, in that there might have been folks who were working on civil rights like in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, but the dynamic has really shifted in that, there are more young people who want to take to the streets, who want to show and express themselves. And social media has been a platform, it's been a platform that enables that, right? So they're expressing themselves on social media, but then they're going to the streets. And I think that's good because, this issue of inequality is kind of mobilizing this generation to be more active in our democracy, which is wonderful. But I don't think that that should distract us from the real issue of what Black Lives Matter is. I mean, it's also an organized effort to ask for certain changes in the system, right? And first and foremost on police brutality, but it could extend to so many other things. So I don't think we should forget that the organizing aspect of it, and that the Black Lives Matter movement is actually making specific demands. That's really important for us to remember.
I think it's brilliant that you spoke about the South Asian community, because a lot of times we tend to be apolitical about it, or tend to be on the sidelines about it. Hassan Minhaj did a great piece after the George Floyd murder where he said, we were the bystanders. We were standing there watching it happen. So a lot of times we can shift blame by saying we're not racist, whereas it's true, whether it is due to mass media, whether it is due to portrayals of Black people in film and television over the years, the perception formed in South Asian communities and communities which are even outside of America, it's different about Black people. If, for instance, South Asian people often complain, or Pakistanis often complain, that Muslims are always shown as terrorists in shows like Homeland. From Black minstrelsy shows, because I did my master's in theater, there's a historical portrayal of Black people as thugs, which has contributed to the perception of them as thugs. And as Cameron said, you can draw a through line from slavery to Jim Crow to the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter. And as Keome said, it's systematic, it's structural. So thank you for speaking about the South Asian community. Cameron, I would love for you to expand on what you said about making that thorough line, that the civil rights movement has been ongoing for a century. This has not come out of nowhere. Cameron, your mic's muted.
Yeah, sure. So, Keome, he touched on something that really goes into this. Protest is a deeply American tradition. From the birth of the United States, we protested against unfair monarchy and authoritarian rule by England. In fact, the civic responsibility of protest itself is enshrined in our Constitution. The First Amendment guarantees that no law shall prohibit peaceful assembly and the ability to make grievances before the government. So we're proud that this is in our Constitution. It's a right, and Black Lives Matter continues in this tradition. And I think too often we look at this as a political moment. It's not a political moment, it's a historical moment. And it's about fighting racism. It's about fighting police brutality. And it's about fighting the unfair treatment of Black people that has gone on way too long, in not this country, but around the world. Black people aren't bad people, despite whatever is portrayed in the media, nor are any darker skinned people. So like Pakistan, the United States is a nation of diverse people of all shades and hues, and no country has escaped the painful vestiges of discrimination. And once we realize that and we understand that Black Lives Matter is a vehicle to understand that around the world, people of African descent or South Asian descent are not always given a fair chance, whether you're Shidi and you live in Sindh, or you're African American, or you're Garifuna and you live in Central America. All societies really need to pursue anti-racism, which means separating ourselves from the colonial view that Europeans or white-skinned people should be favored in any institution. So we risk, if we don't do this, we risk protecting a system that is discriminatory and unequal, and that weakens nations economically, politically, and socially. And so with any movement, the government generally allows for things to happen within those rights for progress. And I think the American government, or rather our founding document, is broad enough to allow for these practices to happen and for this type of progress that's happened, because quite frankly, it's inevitable. If you look back 50, 60, 70 years ago, when these types of movements were happening in the United States, we know who was on the wrong side of history. And unfortunately, it wasn't always the people who we were rooting for and supporting at the time. And through each of those instances in history, from slavery, we knew who was on the wrong side of history. Through the suffragette movement, we know who was on the wrong side of history. Same thing for the civil rights movement, and even now. And so we just have to understand what history really means and what it means for our children and development of our nations in every sphere, economically, politically, and socially.
Brilliant.
And I think another part of this is, for some people, Shamila touched on this earlier, that Twitter and social media has really amplified Black Lives Matter. But it's Black Lives Matter, the movement, and just the issue of equality has been around for hundreds, for really since the birth of the United States, and more broadly, the global perspective, which Shamila touched on. But Black Lives Matter has been around since 2013, and it's gaining global support, I think, because there's so many Black men and women that continue to get killed. There's a larger context in the US history of African-American men and boys being killed by the hands of the police. The fact of the matter is, like 2020, yes, we had George Floyd, who was unarmed, but in 2014, you had high-profile deaths: Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald. I could keep going on. John Crawford, Freddie Gray. Like, there's just so many, and it makes me emotional just speaking their names. And in addition to that, you're seeing Black women and girls who are targeted by the police out of violence, and the reality has sparked the Say Her Name campaign. So you're seeing like an evolution of just so much being compacted of inequality and social injustice and frustration. And I think you're seeing the Generation Z, as well as amplifying it on social media. I think COVID had a part to play, because people were inside their homes and didn't really have anything to do but watch TV, be online, and really like, wait a minute, I'm seeing this. I'm seeing someone being killed live on my newsfeed. But I wanted to touch back on the women really quick, because I think this is an important piece too, because there's a lot of focus on the Black men that have been killed. But in the last 3 or 4 years, you're seeing different people that were killed by the police, like Sandra Bland and Deborah Daynor and Tanya Jefferson, who was from Fort Worth, where I worked at. And this has become such a huge issue mainstream that even Breonna Taylor is on the cover of Vanity Fair this month in the United States. And for those that don't know Vanity Fair, it's a high society magazine that its audience is for elite people throughout the United States and the broader world. But the frustration, I think, is, in summary, the frustration is you're seeing a lot of different police officers that have not been indicted, or they were acquitted, or they weren't fired, and they didn't see any reprimands from these actions where different people, like we see what happened if you read the reports or you see it in your newsfeed, the videos, and people don't feel like there's justice has been had. And so there's a growing sense of we really need to reform our justice system. And I'm pretty sure we'll get to it later, but also defund the police or do other things that are not working. I mean, do things that we can do to enhance our social justice system. Thank you. So
if I may, Shahzad, I just want to pick up on that. So, again, looking at it, connecting it to the global perspective, because this is, it's so cool that we're having this conversation. We're all over, in 2 different countries. There's a reason that we're paying attention to this more. There's a reason why it looks more brutal and more unjust. And that's because the police have different tools and levels of funding at their disposal. And you can draw we're talking about drawing through lines. You can draw a through line to what the police are capable of doing, what tools they have to 9/11. And again, global perspective, right? 9/11 was something that affected a lot of different countries, and including Pakistan. But financially, after 9/11, a lot of money started going into police departments to essentially militarize them and they were being trained, US police were being trained by, military contractors, because, there was a fear that of homegrown terrorism. And so the same tactics that were being used overseas started being socialized within the police, and in an institution that already has a legacy of institutional racism. And that's why if you see American news, you'll see these police where they look like military, essentially. And that's completely, there's so much dissonance with like what police actually do on a day-to-day basis. Like most of police calls are non-violent. Most of what they do is like, oh, my cat is stuck in a tree, like there's a marital dispute, that kind of thing, right? So there's a disconnect there. But and we all know this if we work in government, like once you start getting money for a line item, you don't want that line item to go away. You don't want that money to go away, right? And so there became this dependency also on these resources. And so I think that we're up against something that's not just about, it's built upon this legacy of racism towards Black bodies and Black people and Black experiences, but then it's compounded by what has happened globally vis-a-vis the war on terror. Now, the positive thing related to that is what I've observed in the communities that I'm part of and that I serve is that the discrimination that a lot of Muslim Americans and brown people felt after 9/11, especially young folks, so Gen Z, that has led them to become allies in the fight for racial justice. I mean, because they've experienced it. And before you would see young kids and brown people consider themselves as white, and now they're definitely not white. They are brown, and their identity has shifted. And that is something fascinating and something to like really think through carefully. If you're a policymaker or you're in law enforcement, that's really important for us to kind of hone in on, because that's where you can actually do a lot of good, right? You're stronger now, basically. And that's why you see all these different people coming out into the streets.
Yeah. It brings up a larger point. Yeah.
Yes,
it brings up a larger point, I think, that in my opinion, a lot of different police precincts and different police departments don't necessarily have the right training to deal with the communities that they serve. And Shamila hit on it a little about this. And I think training is really important because we do ask our police to do quite a bit. She mentioned about getting a cat under the tree, or we ask them to provide different services. So domestic violence. So they're like, if they get called to a house, they're having to deal with both partners and have to be a counselor. Or if someone has a mental health issue, they're not trained to deal with that, where somebody may legitimately have a mental health issue, but it's perceived that they're being belligerent or violent, and that's not necessarily the case. And we send them with weapons and guns with them. It's part of them, part of their armor for when they enter these communities. And I think a part of what police departments, what's important is to have a direct line of communication with the communities they serve. They should be able to go in those communities and neighborhoods, whether the police officer looks like them or they know the different streets, they know the community leaders, and there's a better rapport versus the first time that you see a police officer, it could end in death. I think that's really significant to touch upon. And we need to think about how to de-escalate situations instead of escalating them.
Shamila was right about the militarization of police. It's made it much, much worse. We see images of Black Lives Matter, peaceful protesters being dealt with tanks, being dealt with police in riot gear. Once you show up in riot gear with your cannons, with your flame guns, the likelihood of violence increases because you've gone there looking for violence. But what Keome also touched upon, it's not new. You can even go back all the way to Rodney King. Not that Rodney King was the first time it happened. It's probably the first time the video emerged. So it's not like more Black people are now being mistreated by the police. More of it is now being recorded.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And I remember seeing the Rodney King footage, and it felt like I was watching a movie, right? But now in hindsight, like, I feel like I had my eyes closed this whole time, because this is something that was just a daily kind of fear for so many fellow Americans, And so for as much as we hate social media, like, you kind of have to be thankful for it, kind of pulling back the veil on all of this. And to just share briefly a quote from a friend I talked to recently, who she said, she's like, we always knew it was bad, but we just didn't realize how bad it was. And she's not a member of the Black community. And, that's fair for her being honest, and yeah, it really is that bad, I think. And sometimes you need a video to show that.
And when I was in New York, with the legacy of stop and frisk. Cameron?
No, I was just going to say, I think it's, Mila, it's great to hear that, because, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, especially since I've been in Pakistan, is the perception within the diaspora of Pakistanis and Pakistani Americans. Because, as you said, often and for so long, a lot of, immigrant communities have not been the focus, has not been the target of a lot of the injustice going around. And they've been bystanders to a lot of things that have gone on in the Black community for so long. But now you're seeing that solidarity now. And, Black Lives Matter. I mean, just with the, last month with the issue with Hayat Baloch in Balochistan, I saw a sign outside of the press club, and it said, Baloch Lives Matter. And just to think that something that started in the United States made its way all the way to Balochistan, and that resonates with, someone who may not know who George Floyd was or is, and the whole situation, the fact that a part of our movement resonates with them, so they can demand the same things that we demand in our own community, and that's an end to, so much impunity. I mean, this is something that the State Department and the U.S. government fights all over the world, and it's something that we are challenged with currently in our backyard. So, despite what happened in Balochistan, it's important that these movements continue to galvanize young people all over the world to demand better governance, and within the United States itself. Because when you talk to your cousin who is in California and you're from, KP, and you understand that, there's a part of their life that you may not understand, and there's a part of your life that you may not understand. The fact that you have a common language, that you understand that, you know, there's an equality deficit that exists in both of the places that you live. It brings you together, and it also sheds greater light on what it means to be American, because, you know, whether you're first generation or fifth generation American, none of that changes. The African American community has always been at the forefront of civil rights movements and creating progressive and opening rights for plenty of people. And the moment we understand that, with the growing and the changing demographics of the United States, the closer then we can achieve equality. So those elements itself are quite heartening for me, because so long there was a kind of a combative relationship between the African American community and some immigrant groups, because they did come to the United States and they did say, well, we're the model minority. We liken ourselves to more white folks, and we don't understand your cause. Well, right. Welcome aboard. And
yeah, welcome aboard.
let's fight for this together, because we know, you know, this is the nation that you all wanted to come to, and this is the nation that and this is a part of the fight. And, you know, I'm happy to see, you know, Black and brown people and people of all shades, you know, kind of joining hands, you know, like the civil rights movement. There's a very famous picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. With, you know, leaders of, you know, different religious groups. And to see that happening now in different places around the world, it's like I said earlier, it's very heartening. And so we hope that brothers and sisters around the world, even here in Pakistan, supports that cause for greater equality, because what's a good place for Black people is a good place for all people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Welcome aboard also to everybody who's listening. Thank you so much. You can send in your questions as comments. It's a lovely discussion, and I'm not going to spoil it anymore. Shamila, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say what I agree 100% with what Cameron said. He like read my mind. And to add on to that, it's like American democracy and all the benefits that we enjoy as immigrants and as Americans was built by the Black civil rights movement, right? Because it's not like democracy is just born one day and it's perfect. Like, it has to be chipped away at, it has to be practiced, like fail, you know, it has to go through all of that. And the primary struggle in the United States has been around racism, right? And so I think we have a lot to rewrite in terms of our history, because when immigrants, in particular South Asian immigrants came, you know, we came because there was the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1964. It's like, well, wait a minute, how did that happen, right? It's on the backs of Black activists who are fighting for things at home. And then you show up here and we were funneled through a system of elitism anyway. You know, you had to be doctors or engineers or have higher, higher degrees basically, so that you could show you could contribute to the American economy. And that left out a whole bunch of other people, right? And I hear a lot from the community that came in, and I came in 1980. I was born in Pakistan. I was 2 years old when I came. But a lot of the folks that came, they're like, oh, we made it ourselves. We did it ourselves. Like, you know, I had it hard too. Why can't Black people do the same thing, right? But they don't know the history. They don't realize that they're a product of, you know, they themselves as immigrants are a product of all the things that Black people have fought for, first of all. And then at the same time, they're disconnected from that system, systematic racism that keeps certain communities of color in their place. And but now, like we were talking about, brown people have actually been treated with the same injustice as Black people have, but since 9/11, right? Before that, it was just like little things of racism here and there, right? Like I growing up in Ohio, like people called me the N-word. They called me the N-word, right? And it was just like, I didn't even understand what that meant, right? But after 9/11, it's different, because if your communities are exposed to like deliberate surveillance, deliberate targeting at airports, without explanation, it's going to change you, right? And we've changed. And Cameron said, welcome aboard. And what he means is welcome to the civil rights movement too, right? Like you're part of it, whether you want to be part of it or not.
Immigrants, we get the job done. It's lovely how history moves, because MLK Jr. and Gandhi were both inspired by each other in terms of the non-violence movement. Gandhi worked towards gaining independence and freedom in South Asia. MLK, great civil rights leader. And now the second generation immigrants who are like, wait, we were born in America, or we came here when we were really young. this is what the Constitution says and we're entitled to it. Whereas maybe the first generation immigrants were just happy to be there.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Well said.
People who are listening, please do send us your questions. There are also a lot of misnomers about the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of people attribute a lot of things to it or misunderstand it. For instance, something like defund the police. We do need some kind of policing, but a lot of times the defund the police is meant to seen as there will be no policing and we'll just create independent states. What does defund the police actually mean? Like, Keome, if you would like to address this, because you already spoke about how the police are required to at times be a mental health counselor. You might not need a guy with a gun if somebody with a mental health issue has called for 911. So what does defund the police mean?
Yeah, this topic is really passionate to me since I did do local government before being in the State Department. And I think what, if anything, this movement is shedding light on the funding mechanisms of police departments, but also their sphere of influence in our electoral process in the United States. Because I like to think of it as 3 levels, okay? So you have the police department, but they're supported by police unions. And these unions are basically their advocates. They raise money and they support politicians, elected officials who are in office or those that want to get office. And they provide lots of money, lots of funding. And sometimes it can make or break a campaign. And it, lots of times they tend to favor conservative officials or candidates. And then the next level is actual, like the policy level that I think of. And that's like if you have a big city mayor or you want to change your police policy, you have to go before your council and say, this is what we want to do. But then you have this big union and then the police officers themselves, some, not all, but they're like, we don't want to change this thing because an example that I've seen across several cities in the United States is basically at the granular level, you have important and incredibly, you have like, how do I put it? You have, like, for instance, a lot of these cases that I mentioned earlier, in order to even interview a police officer, sometimes you have to wait like 48 hours. Like that's part of their contract is they wait 48 hours. They get to look at the video footage. They get to look at the witnesses that have their transcripts, and they can also have a lawyer present before anyone can even talk to them. That's part of a lot.
This is after an incident, right? This is after an incident or discharging their weapon, yeah. Right?
Exactly. And so that's part of the contract for a lot of police officers. And you're starting to see people saying, wait a minute, if I were to get arrested as a citizen, like I don't get 48 hours to like, you know, just kind of contemplate about life and then the situation and read the transcripts. So it gives a lot of benefits to police officers, and people are saying, you know, that's not the right way that we should do this. And then you also have, it's really hard to fire them, or and sometimes you don't get to see like if a family or an organization is upset with the way a case was handled, they don't get to see that file of like, have they had previous grievances or have they been involved in other incidents like that. For a lot of police departments, that's covered under their protection. And so a lot of people are starting to say, we needed, if the police officers in certain areas don't want to play by want to change the rules, then we need to defund them. So you've seen this like in like Camden, where they literally said, okay, we know that we have good apples and bad apples, but in order to take away the bad apples, we're just going to defund the police, and we're going to take our police department and move it to the county level where we can renegotiate the terms of how we hire police officers. And so you're starting to see a little pendulum shift that way of we need to relook at how we fund our police. So it's not necessarily that we want to, like that some people want to completely abolish police departments. We need public safety everywhere. It's important. That's one of the most fundamental important things. Everybody wants to be in a safe neighborhood, no matter who you are. That goes all across the world. That's part of it, is looking at the way police are structured. And so you're starting to see like different mayors, like the mayor of LA.
Our city.
Yep, he said that, we're gonna do, I think it was like 100 or 200 million we're taking away, and we're gonna redirect that and invest it in our communities. And you're seeing other mayors like in Houston and as well as Chicago and Atlanta and DC, who are all DC, Houston, and DC, Chicago, and Atlanta. They're all ran by African American females, and so they have the arduous task of being an African American, being a woman, and also having to see both sides of the picture and deal with this. So, I think the way that they're approaching it is they're trying to have an all hands on deck approach to, let's look at how we can rearrange the structure of how we're doing things, because clearly what we're doing in the past has not worked.
So apart from systematic racism, there are also institutional barriers. I think another thing is, who's going to prosecute the police? It's going to be the prosecutors who work with the police. The police have to work with the prosecutors, because that's just how the system is designed. Add qualified immunity to that. For instance, when a police officer blatantly pushed a 70, 80-year-old peaceful protester, and everybody saw the video, the entire police department walked away. And once the police officer was punished, the entire police department protested. So once they're a union and they're all together, and you've created a versus mentality where the police is not part of the community, they're enforced onto the community. And as Shamila said, there's militarization. You create the seeds for conflict. How do you overcome these institutions of power, or this sense of brotherhood with the police? How do you overcome all of that?
I don't think there's a how-to guide, but what I will say is every city, no matter where you live, whether you live in Pakistan, United States, United Kingdom, every community is different and all of their needs are different. But what I think an underlying thing that we can look at is, like for instance, in California, there's legislation to where prosecutors and police sheriffs, they're making it to where they cannot receive police union contributions, so that they don't have that influence as much as, or that pressure, because I think that's something to be said for. You're also seeing like the movement, I think in general, is kind of applying pressure points on our state, local, and federal, and even global levels, because we're seeing these protests in like Berlin and Rio de Janeiro and everywhere. So it's not just the US now, but you're looking at, okay, here's the situation. We see a lot of inequality. We see one side that's being victimized or perceived to be victimized, and then we see the other side that nothing has changed. And so we have to look at how can we do that. In some ways I've seen are, again, the whole prosecutor and not taking contributions, taking away body cams, also chipping away at some of the, so body cams, but also chipping away at some of the rights that some of these police officers have, that basically they're bulletproof in a sense. Yeah.
Shamila, from a public policy standpoint, how do you see this?
Well, I think, I was just, as I was listening to Keome, and I was learning a lot. I mean, it's great to hear kind of how things unfold at the local level. So when I look at it, I see this layer of politics over all of this. And sometimes you can just like say, oh, it's all political, and it can be dismissive. But I do think that we have to acknowledge we're living in a very hyper-partisan moment in the United States. And, partisanship is like something that always exists, but then it, depending on leadership and how people feel and how citizens feel about their government, like it can either be kind of amplified or it just kind of sits to the side, right? And I do think that it's heavily amplified right now. And what that means is that any issue can turn into a partisan issue. And somehow the police are, they're more than their occupation, right? And that isn't something that just emerged. Like it has to have, it's rooted in a legacy. It's rooted in kind of the way the institution has been treated. It's rooted in laws and what they're able to do and what they're not able to do. But that whole, like how the police are treated is, again, it's like more than just like a function of government. And I think that partisan voices have taken advantage of that, rather than trying to fix what, you know, is broken between communities and police. It's become an us versus them, again, to use the phrase that was just said. And I think that makes it all the more harder to actually like solve things. Like it escalates, right? So not only do you have like the escalation, like just in terms of physically on the ground, you also, and the tools that you have at your disposal as police, but then you also have this political escalation, which is even somewhat, it's harder to walk back from, you know, and like, and we talked about this, like the police are in a tough situation in that like they get called to do all these things that they're not trained for. And so, you know, a lot of this defunding means that you could potentially take these resources and train, you know, law enforcement in a completely different way that actually like helps these communities. So like if I was in a local policymaker position, I would be thinking like, okay, well, how many calls out of 10 are actually related to mental health? How many calls out of 10 are actually related to domestic violence? Okay, that means we actually need people on our force that are trained in X, Y, and Z, right? How can we set up steps to enable that? Because you know you're not going to get that right away. So I would start, like from the policy perspective, I would start looking at the systems that create the kind of police officers that you have, and that also box them in to a certain extent, right? Like, do you need to have a college degree to be a cop? I don't think so. I don't think you do.
You don't.
Right, you don't. So like, I mean, if I went and got a job after high school, like I would need some help. You know what I mean? Like, so, and it doesn't mean that everybody needs to go to graduate school or college, but what it does mean is that there's a different type of training and investment in people that want to go into law enforcement that's required. And that's what I would start to think through, rather than, because I think when people hear defund the police, it just falls into that partisan bucket, and it makes it all the more harder for like actual like policymakers to like start to have conversations. And like Keome mentioned, like the women, you know, these cities are run by African-American women, and I don't envy them, because like if you have dark skin, regardless of your gender, you're going to have all these other biases that you come up against. And then if you're a woman, then it like adds a whole nother layer to it, right? And so those leaders will need all the community support that they can get to kind of tackle these issues.
They can be part of the squad.
I saw a very interesting infographic today of Prince George's County's, you know, their budget, and I think out of their $300 million budget, 11 was it that it was something like, it was like 11 million was devoted to education and health, and it was something like 75 million was devoted to the police for line items, as Shamila pointed out earlier. And you know, you have one of these line items, it's like, you know, maintenance for you know, BMW motorcycle, and you know, things that we see as trivial, but perhaps maybe something, you know, very near and dear to the performance of that police department. And you know, I think we all know, you know, being an officer, because I think so often when these conversations are had about, you know, defund the police, it becomes kind of it sounds like that we're anti-police. We're you know, I don't think anyone's anti-police, but they're just kind of pro-people. And when you have an issue like this, an issue that's, you know, my grandfather had the same issue. You know, this is not an old, you know, great grandfathers had the issue with police officers and African-American men and women, and just impunity and just not seeing that personhood. I think it's important to also talk about recruitment and of who these officers are. You need diverse and inclusive police departments, people who come from these communities, as Keome pointed out earlier in the call, you have to recruit more. You have to, when you have a lot of, folks from diverse communities who want to get into criminal justice, but also they need to be in public safety as well. And so when these folks are recruiting, I went to a Black college, I went to Morehouse, and, every once in a while you see a military stall set up there, and, you have the reserves who are recruiting, or Army or whatever like that. There's no reason why police officers can't be recruiting from, these top Black schools around the country and going into these communities and saying, listen, if you want to be a part of this community, why don't you join me to protect it? And I think it's important that folks see the police as a way of changing the system. If you work from within, and Shahzad, going to your question, if you work within and you try to take on that kind of fidelity head on, you start to see the nuances, and you start to understand a little bit about why certain behaviors are widely accepted. I think that groupthink it's apparent in any organization, and I think that when you're talking about defund the police, it's problematic for police officers and people who are, I guess, on the more conservative side of the political spectrum, because it seems that you're attacking public safety, and you're not. In some communities, you're protecting it. And so it needs to have a more inclusive voice of who has the badge, who are the boys in blue, and who those communities are. They need to be much more apparent. We did a program with last year with law enforcement officers from Liari and that area surrounding Liari and Karachi. And, we had 17 women police officers who we've supported through different trainings. And we put them in the same communities as girls from that community. It was the first time that they met. And so it's not just an America thing, it's a law enforcement culture, because you got to bring the people together. I may be a guardian, but, at the same time, I'm here to protect and serve as a police officer. And so if we're questioning what my budget looks like, it seems that you need to reallocate it if you're going to keep the money toward more public safety issues, more public engagement, more community resilience programs. In Detroit, in my hometown, they have the Police Athletic League. And the Police Athletic League has been a instrumental part of bringing the community and the law enforcement agencies together since Detroit's most violent days in the 1990s, where you just got cops playing basketball and football and all these types of organized sports with people from their own community. And it allows for the kids in the community to see cops as friends. The cops is to see these young people as humans. And if that's something that could be replicated just around the world, just in these major cities and these communities, you may see something different. But right now, you justly point out, Shamila, it's hyper partisan, and people can't see the forest from the trees.
Yeah. I think it's a great hashtag, defund the police. It trends, which is why maybe the messaging has not been as clear as it should be. I think even the police officer would be happy if there's a 611 for mental health concerns. We've seen instances in America where a person lying on the ground with his hands up was shot. A kid with a toy gun was shot. A person in New York holding a lead pipe was shot. Because once you prime the police officer to think there's violence on every end, they might be suffering through PTSD. They might have seen a friend of theirs being shot. And once they're trained to keep one hand on the gun, the likelihood of them shooting that just increases. We have a question from the audience, and I would love for either Keome and Cameron to take this. The question is about the narrative of MLK versus Malcolm X in terms of violence and non-violence. I'd like to link that to BLM and ask either of you to address this. There's also this notion or this dismissal of BLM by some people as looters, or they call them, there's a lot of looting happening. And we also spoke about the model minority. How much of it is also colored by a perception that a protest is only valid when it's completely non-violent? Once it's like Salma, like even though they're loosening the dogs on you, you don't move. Whereas even if you make a tiny mistake, like you mentioned Eric Garner, the fact that he was selling loose cigarettes, that's enough to almost justify this extrajudicial killing. So in terms of violence and non-violence, the efficacy of that, and the perception by some people of Black Lives Matters as looters?
So that's a really loaded question. There's a lot of different components to it. So I'll, I like to, I think everyone likes to, cite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who's the most famous alumnus of my college at Morehouse. And at the end of the day, it's about seeing humanity in other people. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., more so Malcolm X, at the end of his life, he understood the importance of more community and nonviolence. But, everyone likes to cite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the champion for nonviolence. And, he learned from Howard Thurman, who understood kind of, social activism and the nonviolence movement. But it's important to understand that, both of these champions of civil rights were both assassinated, despite whatever their ideology was. So you had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was, shot in cold blood in Memphis, Tennessee, after giving a significant speech about what his views were on the social struggles and even the foreign policy of the country that he lived in. And, Malcolm X, he traveled the world, he made Hajj, he'd understood, that there was a new understanding of how, civil rights and equality should be attained. So the historical narrative of, nonviolence versus violent movements is kind of a moot point, because if you look at both of the highly, cited figures in these movements, they both ended in the same way. So I'd say that the biggest misconception is that Black Lives Matter is a violent looting organization. I don't know it to be, and I think if you talk to people who are administratively involved in Black Lives Matter and the people who go out and they wave signs, and I don't think either and any of them. Everyone wants to go home at night. At the end of the day, everyone wants to go home at night. I don't think anyone wants to ruin things. But even President Trump pointed out is that sometimes these types of events, sometimes these movements are they're overshadowed by outsiders, and I think that that's important to point out, is because sometimes you have folks who maybe not a part of the movement, but they're acting, as my grandmother would say, they're acting a fool. And we have to understand that when you're looking for equality, you're looking for civil rights, when you're being good and you're being quiet and you're doing everything that you're supposed to do, there's going to be frustration. And I'm not, I don't think anyone condones violence, but we just saw a situation where a young man drove across state lines to protect property because he was afraid of what this movement was going to do. And he killed some people. He killed people. So I say all that to say it's about recognizing the humanity in someone. It's about sitting down and talking to folks. This is an ongoing movement. It's not going anywhere. And I think that the louder that the voices get and the more afraid people become, maybe the more that they'll listen and they'll experience things themselves. Just like people from outside of the community, they've been able to experience and become party to a lot of the injustice that the country has seen all over historically, and they become allies as well.
Yeah, I'd like to just add that, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X will in their own rights, both equally as influential and important to human rights across the world. And I don't like the notion of having to compare the two, because you have two highly influential, successful men of color that were contributing to their community, but with the narrative. And I think one aspect of this movement, as well as the civil rights movement in general, is you have people that like to control a narrative that people are violent or they're looting or they're too passive. Like, there's just different approaches to the same goal, which is equality and having the humanity and decency of respecting each other. So I think that whoever controls the narrative, because I think it's really interesting that when a group of young people get together for Black Lives Matters, and some news outlets report it as looting and riots and it's dangerous and unruly, but then you can have another group of people go up to Cameron's home state of Lansing, the capital, and go into the building with their guns, hundreds of hundreds of guys just with their guns going to the state capitol and they have a peaceful protest. I often like visually, I find that troubling. I would be scared to see 100 people in a state capitol with guns. That's their right, and it was peaceful. Yet some people with most of these protests, they don't have guns, they don't have weapons, but it's not peaceful. It's unruly. So again, I think it goes back to what Cameron and Shamila was saying is I think a part of it is the narrative and how people are portrayed, but I just personally don't like to pit two of our most influential African American men against each other. I just can't.
I like to add, for people who are watching this, I challenge you to look beyond what you're seeing in the media and know the origins behind the fight, all of these fights, and you'll learn that the lives of numerous unarmed Black men have been lost at the hands of police officers. And these have been key issues in every movement led by the African American community.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, the way that we look at leaders is definitely influenced by kind of how, what our role is in life. So if you're a minority and you're a leader, you're going to be picked apart in so many different ways as if you're not. And we do this to ourselves as well, right? And and it's just not fair. Just don't do it, right? When you say like, well, MLK was like this and Malcolm, it's like, no, nobody is perfect. No leader is perfect. Like they will make mistakes and they will make them openly sometimes, but that's what makes them a better leader eventually, right? And I think we should ask ourselves, like, do we allow that same kind of scrutiny to other leaders of other backgrounds? But then to think about it more constructively, I would say that, there's always like a street game that needs to be played out in any kind of movement or for a cause. And then there's also this like other level, which has to do with like, dealing with politics and stakeholders and actual policymakers. And I think what we saw with MLK and Malcolm X were like two leaders who are operating in overlapping playing fields, but then they had other kind of objectives that they wanted to achieve, and they weren't alone. Like not everybody has to do everything. So if you look at the cohort of leaders at that time, like there was also like a James Baldwin. And if folks haven't read James Baldwin, you've got to read James Baldwin, because he's writing like decades ago, but it reads as if he's writing today. And, I Am Not Your Negro is like that documentary is a great one to watch, because it talks about his own kind of concern that like he's not doing what MLK is doing, or he's not doing what Malcolm X or like Medgar Evers are doing. Like they're out in the communities, and he was off in Europe writing about race, race relations. But he played a vital role and function as well. Like he was the philosopher behind this movement. And so I would encourage like all the folks that are like feel very energized by what's happening in the fight for racial justice to think about yourself and like what you can contribute, rather than like, I need to do everything, because you do not absolutely have to do everything, because then you're not going to be effective. You're just not. I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, I agree
100%. I'd also like to recommend 13th on Netflix.
Yeah, that one is good too. Yeah.
The Central Park 5 documentary as well. Keome?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And look, at the end of the day, we all have a part to play in striving for and achieving human equality and decency. Everyone should be able to go in their neighborhood and walk freely and feel safe. Everyone should have the same dignity and respect that people that don't look like them, that might be lighter or white, and I think we all can work together to dismantle this. And it's such a huge issue that, like Shamila mentioned, just because someone's at the forefront and they're on the news or they're getting the press coverage, like it's just as helpful what you can do in your communities too. And when I sit on these panels and people ask, like, what is something I can do? And it starts at home, like talking to your friends, talking to your family members about if you notice something that is off, if people say something that is biased or prejudiced, or if you see an indecency, call it out at that level and explain why it's not okay. Like, you're doing a part there. It may seem small, but you may be impacting someone's life or protecting someone's life in some cases. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, you know, you can be the president of the United States, you can be a diplomat, you can be the prime minister here. People are going to view you how they want to view you. But at the end of the day, you can control your narrative and what you put out. And one of the things, you know, there's no right or wrong to being a good leader or bad, like being a good leader, because people are going to view you how they view you. Just before I came to Pakistan back in May, I was like the last week that I was in Virginia, at the border of DC. I was just walking in my neighborhood, like literally just grabbing a hamburger because I wanted to get one last quick fix before I came to Pakistan. And police, I had a brown paper bag in my hand, walking in my neighborhood. And when I left the restaurant to walk back to my house, I noticed that a police officer was trailing me as I was walking. And then I switched streets and they went past me, and then they looked back again, and they kept doing it again and again for 7 blocks until I reached my house. And like, they knew that I was entering a building. But for that police officer, the only thing that I can think of, why were they following me? Because it was in broad daylight. I had on professional clothes, you know, and I was in my neighborhood. I clearly had authority where I was walking, but I assumed that I was profiled, and they thought that I wasn't where I needed to be, or I looked out of place. So at the end of the day, yes, like Cameron and I are diplomats, but we still face challenges on a daily basis. And so does other people, like Shamila mentioned earlier. Like, you can be a good immigrant, but at the end of the day, people are going to view you unless they've been educated and trained. And I think it goes back to what we are talking about here in this discussion today with this whole movement and police reform in a broader sense. Is it all stems from how people are trained, how people think, and how they can react to certain situations.
I'm in absolute awe of both your grace and your brilliance, despite being so impassioned about it. Both Cameron and Keome, the fact that you can articulate it so well. And this is why I love doing 2-hour podcasts, because I honestly feel like we just got started and it's already beyond 5. And I would love to talk to you guys for hours, but we are constrained by time. But I really do genuinely want to compliment all 3 of you. It's been brilliant just to listen to you. You cannot substitute the lived experiences. So when Keome and Cameron, both of you are talking from a place of a lived experience, and it's so important for people who may not be a part of that lived experience to listen to that lived experience, to learn from. And as Shamila has so brilliantly, so, you know, in a really concise manner, Shamila, I'm sorry if this is going to be embarrassing, but it's brilliant how concisely you're able to hit the point every single time and bring it all together and really nail what the issue is. So it's been an absolute pleasure to just listen to all 3 of you. And I know I'm running way beyond time to just even say this, but in absolute gratitude for the 3 of you for doing this. Thank you so much. I'd love for all of you to get the final say. And I know we're really running out of time. And there's a question about Black community participation in the upcoming election and the importance of vote. If you want to address that, sure. Otherwise, whatever the last words that you want to have on this, the floor is all yours. Let's start with Shamila.
Oh, I just want to say thank you. I learned a lot, and I appreciated Keeman's kind of analysis and sharing his knowledge at the local government level. And Cameron, I think, you know, what better person to represent the United States overseas? I mean, he, like, the way he is explaining American history is exactly how it should be taught. I think that that's very inspiring for me, and folks in Pakistan are very lucky to have these 2 there. So, and just thank you for hosting us, Shahzad.
It's an added bonus that Keeman looks like Sterling K. Brown, who's one of the most beautiful looking man in American television. If anybody watches This Is Us.
Thank you both. Thank you all for allowing me to have a conversation with you all and our audience. This is such an important topic, and I think I said what I wanted to say, and I've also learned some things along the way and how we look at things. So thank you, Shamila, for giving the perspective of playing out even today, like in Europe and in the United States, of course, but these issues just keep coming up, and we just got to keep talking about it, keep getting people engaged, and we'll get there. Thank you.
You know, thank you so much. You know, it's great to be in Pakistan, and it's great to have these types of platforms to discuss really what is important, not only for the United States, but for the world, and understanding. As you know, I was in the United States from March to July, early July, and I got a chance to see firsthand really what the Black Lives Matter movement was all about and what these protests were. And whether in them or surveying the before them or after them and what happened, there's an energy going on across the United States and across the world for change, and I'm very hopeful of what that will actually bring. I would like to leave everyone with kind of three last things. The first thing is to respect human rights. Everyone has a right to life, a right to live out their religion, their creed, be who they are, to pursue the things that they need in order to feel free in their own society. Pursue anti-racism. Your skin color doesn't or should never reflect how well you'll do in society. It's not always if you're white, you're right. If you're black, get back. It should be really about your merit. And look up things like microaggressions, small comments, one-offs, things that you think that will make other people feel uncomfortable. It may be funny to you, but it may put someone in a very, very bad place. So anti-racist behavior is very important to pursue. And then also for everyone listening, demand good governance and justice from your leaders. You are, as a citizen, a part of your social contract of being wherever you are is your ability to change your government. And we believe truly that that is an inalienable right. And we believe that that's freedom. And so with everyone, thank you so much for participating. Keome and I are here for another year, and for Keeman's here for another year and a half, right?
Yeah, I'll be down in Karachi this time.
Call me.
Replacing me this time next year. So
we'll do a socially distant hangout.
So for PUAN, for all of our family in the Pakistan-U.S. Alumni Network, we're a friend and resource. The United States is a friend and resource of the people of Pakistan. And thank you so much for having this, and everyone who's participating in exchange programs. Thank you so much, because through you, we know that our partnership is very strong. So thank you. U.S. Pakistan Zindabad.
Brilliant. That's what a perfect diplomat. Do remember us when you become president, Cameron. Don't forget us. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.